All right, so today we're going to dive into something
Okay.
pretty thought-provoking, I think,
Yeah.
the harm impact spectrum.
Okay.
And we've got this really fascinating set of sources that kind of take us beyond just like basic definitions of harm
Yeah.
into this really nuanced way of seeing its effects.
Right. And it's a framework that's becoming more and more popular across so many fields because it helps us to sort of grasp how harm isn't really a black and white issue.
Right.
You know, it's not just about the severity of a single incident,
Right.
but it's about a whole spectrum of factors.
Yeah, that's what I thought was so interesting from the get-go.
Yeah.
Like, our first source really emphasizes that it's not just about how bad something is, but the frequency,
Yes.
the accumulation,
Yes.
and who's being impacted.
Yes.
That's a pretty big shift in perspective.
It is, absolutely.
Huh.
It pushes us to consider, those quote-unquote smaller harms that might get overlooked individually,
Right.
but can have this huge collective impact over time.
Right.
And particularly, for groups that are already marginalized.
Right. And the use... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
One of the classic examples of that is microaggressions,
Right.
which I know we don't need to define for this audience. But
Well, but what I thought was interesting was how they connected the microaggressions to the spectrum idea.
yes.
Because it's not just about, like, that one awkward comment at the office party.
Exactly.
It's the constant...
It's drip, drip,
drip, drip, drip.
Yeah, that wears people down.
Exactly. And the harm impact spectrum gives us a way to actually, like, measure that drip,
Okay.
to understand how those seemingly minor incidents add up to create really significant barriers and emotional distress for people.
Right.
And it validates those experiences too.
Right.
And it pushes us to think about interventions.
Right. So speaking of interventions,
Yeah.
that's where I think our second source comes in.
Okay.
It dives deep into how nonprofits are using the harm impact spectrum.
And they've got this very specific 6-step process that they outline.
Yes.
But before we unpack all that, I'm curious, like, have you ever encountered this type of approach, like in the real world?
Oh, I think we all have, probably without even realizing it.
Okay.
If you think about organizations that tackle issues like bullying in schools or discrimination in the workplace, they're dealing with a range of harms, from the very subtle to the very severe.
Right.
And they require that multifaceted approach.
Right. So let's break down the 6-step process a little bit. The first one being identify relevant harms.
Yes.
And the source uses the example of a nonprofit that's working on housing insecurity.
Which is a great example because, the harms associated with housing insecurity are so diverse.
Right.
You've got people facing eviction. You've got folks struggling with affordability.
Yeah.
Families experiencing homelessness.
Right.
All of those require, a different type of intervention.
And that's where that second step comes in, right?
Yes.
Mapping harms onto a spectrum.
Exactly.
It's about understanding the nuances,
Yeah.
not just like the broad categories.
Exactly. It's about considering not just the severity of a single instance,
Ah,
but also, how frequent is it? How long does it last?
right,
And how might different populations experience that harm differently?
right.
So, for instance, the impact of eviction on a single mother with young children is going to be far more profound than, say, on a single adult with a stable income.
Right. That level of detail I thought was really fascinating.
Yes.
Because it's not just saying housing insecurity is bad.
Right.
It's saying, let's understand the specific ways it manifests and who's most impacted.
Yes, exactly.
And then they can tailor their approach.
Exactly. And that directly informs the next step,
Right.
which is prioritizing interventions and resources.
Right.
You wouldn't use the same approach for somebody at risk of eviction
Right.
as you would for someone who's chronically homeless.
It's about like tailoring the response to the specific point on that harm impact spectrum.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I imagine this also helps these organizations be more strategic with their often limited resources.
Absolutely. By focusing on those interventions that are most likely to make a difference at different levels of harm.
Right.
They can maximize their impact.
Right. And then, of course, you have to track all that.
Right.
Yeah.
That leads us to step 4.
Okay.
Which is monitor and evaluate impact.
Okay.
It's not enough to just throw resources at a problem.
Right.
You need to know if those resources are actually making a difference.
Right. So this is where things like data collection come in.
Yes.
Feedback from the people that they serve.
Absolutely.
Program evaluation.
Yes.
It's about accountability.
It's about being accountable and making sure that their efforts are really aligned with their mission.
Right. And that they're actually effective.
And constantly learning and adapting.
Oh, okay.
The harm impact spectrum isn't a static thing.
Right.
It's a tool that helps these organizations be responsive to the changing needs and ensure they're truly serving their communities. So it's a process, not a destination, kind of.
Exactly.
Right. And to make all this work,
Yes.
step 5 is create a harm-aware organizational culture.
Yes.
What I thought was interesting here was the emphasis on training staff,
Mm-hmm.
promoting empathy,
Yes.
holding everyone accountable, even for seemingly small missteps.
Yes, because even those small missteps repeated over time can contribute to a culture where harm is normalized.
Right.
So it's about creating an environment where everybody is really sensitive to the potential impact of their actions, both big and small.
Yeah, making that awareness part of their DNA.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then finally, step 6 is collaborate with other organizations.
Yes, because no single organization can address these really complex issues in isolation.
Right.
They need to share data,
Yeah.
coordinate services, work together to advocate for those systemic changes that can truly address the root causes of harm.
Right. It's all about partnerships, right? To create
Right.
lasting change.
Absolutely.
So before we move on to our next source, which takes us into the world of street epistemology.
Yes.
What about this whole approach with nonprofits really struck you as important or insightful?
I think what resonates most with me is that emphasis on really understanding the nuances of harm
Right.
and tailoring those interventions accordingly.
Okay.
It's a move away from those one-size-fits-all solutions
Okay.
towards a more personalized and ultimately more impactful approach.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that harm exists on a spectrum,
Yes.
and our responses need to reflect that complexity.
Absolutely.
But what about when it comes to our personal beliefs?
Yes.
That's where our next source takes us, and it's a fascinating connection.
Okay.
Buckle up.
All right.
Hey, we might not be human, but we could still outsmart you.
Yeah, I'd be a little intimidated, honestly.
Me too.
Welcome back.
Yes.
Before we took a moment to reflect,
Rest.
we were delving into how nonprofits are using the harm impact spectrum to guide their work. Now, get ready for a little bit of a shift in perspective.
Okay.
Because our next source explores this concept through the lens of something called street epistemology.
Okay. Yeah, I'll admit when I first saw street epistemology, I was like, oh, that sounds a little academic.
Right.
But bear with us, dear listener, because it actually gets really relevant
Yeah.
to this whole discussion about harm.
What's interesting about street epistemology is that it's not about winning arguments or forcing people to change their minds.
Right.
It's really about having these very respectful,
Okay.
open-minded conversations that help us understand how people arrive at their beliefs.
So it's like taking a deep dive into the thought process,
Exactly.
the reasoning,
Yeah.
the experiences that shape our understanding of the world.
Exactly.
But where does the harm impact spectrum fit into all of this?
Well, the source argues that sometimes even beliefs that we hold with the best of intentions
Okay.
can have unintended negative consequences.
Right.
And so street epistemology, when sort of combined with the harm impact spectrum, gives us a way to explore those consequences.
So it's not just about whether a belief is true or false. It's about what is the impact of that belief.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What are those ripple effects that it might have on individuals and communities?
Right. And they give some really interesting questions in these conversations. Like, for example, let's say someone believes that certain social welfare programs discourage people from working.
Okay.
A street epistemologist might ask them,
Yeah.
on a scale of 1 to 10,
Uh-huh.
how harmful do you think this belief could be if it was adopted by everyone in your community?
Right.
And why did you choose that number?
Yeah. That's a really powerful question.
It is.
Because it pushes people to think beyond their own immediate perspective
Right.
and to consider those broader social implications of their beliefs.
Right. It's like holding up a mirror to those potential harms.
Exactly.
Yeah. And another question that I thought was really interesting was, how might someone from a different background
Yeah.
who doesn't share your assumptions
Uh-huh.
be affected by this belief?
Right.
Could the effect be minor, moderate, or major?
Exactly. And I think that one really highlights how the impact of beliefs can vary so much depending on someone's social location,
Right.
their experiences, their vulnerability.
Your lived experience.
Exactly.
Yep.
It forces us to consider those different perspectives
Right.
and to acknowledge that what might seem harmless to one person could be deeply hurtful or harmful to another.
It's about empathy, right?
It's about cultivating empathy
Yeah.
and recognizing that our beliefs don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
They have a social impact, and that impact can often be measured on that spectrum of harm.
You know, what's interesting to me is that even if our listeners aren't planning on like engaging in formal street epistemology dialogues,
Right.
these questions I think are still so valuable for self-reflection.
Absolutely.
You know, they challenge us to examine our own beliefs
Uh-huh.
and to consider those consequences, you know, even the unintended ones.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating a more critical awareness of how our beliefs shape our actions and then how those actions sort of ripple outward, impacting the world around us.
This whole conversation has just really got me thinking about how interconnected we are.
Yeah.
How even our most personal beliefs can have these social consequences.
Right.
It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to examine those beliefs,
Yes.
to challenge them when necessary,
Absolutely.
and to make sure they're aligned with our values
Yes.
and our desire to create a more just and compassionate world.
It's a powerful realization.
It is.
And I think this connection between the harm impact spectrum and street epistemology offers a really valuable framework for navigating those complex ethical waters.
Right. It's like we're adding an ethical dimension to critical thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not just evaluating the logic of an argument, but also its potential to contribute to harm or to promote well-being.
Exactly. And that is such a vital shift in perspective
Yeah.
because it reminds us that knowledge isn't neutral.
Right.
It has the power to heal or to harm. And we have a responsibility to wield it wisely.
So before we wrap up this whole deep dive,
Yes.
there's one more thought-provoking concept that I think we need to explore.
Okay.
And it connects this whole idea of harm to something that might seem a bit unexpected at first.
Okay.
The pursuit of truth.
Ooh, interesting.
Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll unpack that very connection.
All right.
All right. Don't be a bullheaded viewer. Subscribe and stay in the loop. It's like, are they calling their non-subscribers stubborn?
A little bit.
Like they're like, you better get on board.
Join the herd. Or
Yeah.
you're just a bullheaded,
Exactly.
identity out there.
So welcome back to the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've been exploring the harm impact spectrum through all these different lenses,
Right.
from general applications to nonprofits to even street epistemology.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to connect it to something that might seem a little bit surprising at first.
Okay.
The pursuit of truth.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's a connection that I think often gets overlooked.
Right.
We tend to think about truth in this very abstract intellectual way.
Yes.
But our source makes this really compelling case that what we believe to be true has very real, tangible consequences. Like, I was really struck by how they phrased it.
Okay.
They said, our beliefs about the world, even those we hold most sacred, can have a shadow side.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. It's almost like saying our pursuit of truth needs an ethical checkup.
Yes. It's not enough to just ask, is this belief factually accurate?
Right.
We also need to consider, what are the potential consequences of believing this? Could it lead to harm, even unintentionally?
And that's where the harm impact spectrum comes in, right?
Exactly.
Because it gives us this framework for analyzing our beliefs, not just in terms of their truthfulness, but also in terms of their potential impact.
It's like a risk assessment for our ideas.
I like that.
Yeah.
So how do we actually put this into practice, though?
Right.
I mean, examining our own deeply held beliefs, I think, can be really uncomfortable.
It can be very uncomfortable. It takes courage and humility.
It could be like shaking the foundations of your worldview.
Absolutely.
So the source gives a few tips.
Yeah.
One that really resonated with me was this idea of intellectual humility.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So intellectual humility is basically about acknowledging that we might be wrong. That our understanding is always evolving, that we need to be open to new information and new perspectives.
It's being open to the possibility that you don't have all the answers.
Exactly.
Right. And if we're clinging too tightly to our own beliefs,
Yeah.
we're less likely to see the blind spots,
Right.
right? The potential to cause harm.
Exactly.
It's like one of those optical illusions, where
Oh,
you
yeah.
have to kind of shift your perspective
Uh-huh.
to see the whole picture.
Exactly.
And another suggestion that they had was to actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Yes.
Especially from people who have different lived experiences and backgrounds than our own.
Because that can help us to challenge our assumptions and to see the world through a wider lens.
Right. And it's also about understanding that your individual understanding is always going to be limited.
Yes.
Right. And that we can learn so much from listening to other people,
Perhaps.
especially those who have been marginalized or harmed by those dominant narratives.
Right. It's a reminder that the pursuit of truth is not a solitary endeavor.
Yeah.
It's a collective process that requires open dialogue, respectful debate,
Yeah.
a willingness to learn from each other.
And ultimately, I think the source argues that a more ethical approach to truth-seeking can lead to a more just and compassionate world.
Absolutely.
It's about understanding that our beliefs have power,
Yes.
right? They can shape reality.
They do.
And we have this responsibility, I think,
Yes.
to make sure that our pursuit of truth aligns with our values.
It's our deepest value.
Right. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yes.
I hope you'll walk away with kind of a renewed sense of curiosity,
I hope
a
so.
willingness to maybe question your own assumptions,
Yeah.
and a commitment to using your understanding of the harm impact spectrum to really guide your actions and interactions with the world.
I think that's beautifully said.
And remember, dear listener, this is just the beginning of your own deep dive
Yes.
into this fascinating world of the harm impact spectrum.
Right.
So keep questioning,
Keep learning.
keep learning, and keep striving to make the world a little bit better, one thoughtful action at a time.